why did he join the army? He had a future in Toronto, and he was also, I think by the time he joined up, he was 30. So, we'll never know. It's a mystery.
Not for us, but for our country. The motto of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment during the Second World War, and a motto embodied by countless soldiers who fought and died for their beliefs. Major Forbes Bell Fisher, a native of Northeast Hope, Ontario, knew this motto well and lived it until the end when he was killed during one of the battles for Tilly-la-Campagne. Though seemingly unremarkable on the surface, Forbes Fisher's life and death provides a unique look into the background of a Canadian officer during the Second World War and allows for an in-depth look at the social and military context that surrounded Fisher's life. Forbes Fisher was born on June 24, 1909, to Isabel Patterson Fisher and John Donald Fisher. His family originated in Scotland, and his great-grandfather immigrated to Canada as an infant, likely from the hamlet of Amalree in Perthshire. Those who immigrated to Canada often named the large sections of land they received after their hometowns, which is likely the origin of the community of Amalree in Perth County, Ontario. Fisher's great-great-grandfather, Alexander McNaughton Fisher, lived in this house with his family after he immigrated, a landmark that is still standing today on a hill that was named for the family.
And it's quite hilly. In fact, the hill it's on used to be called Fisher's Hill, but it's been cut down now. See, not only was my side, it would be like, when they came from Scotland, there was a man named James Fisher, and he brought his own sons and two nephews with him, one nephew being my great-great-grandfather. So there was Fisher farms all along in there, both sides of this road. Even out to Highway 78 when you come from Shakespeare to Stratford, on the north side of the road, Fishers had farms in there. There's not a Fisher living in Northeast Hope now, but all my people, it's literally like you took most of a village of, let's say, Niagara-on-the-Lake or one of these little places, and took them and transported them en masse and dumped them into a little area here. So all the cemeteries in Scotland have pretty well the same names as the cemeteries out here in Northeast Hope. That it was a tough time back there, I suppose. So from that, I suppose in a way I still have I have a bit of my dad, that not having known him, but I've got history, his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. It's, yeah.
Unfortunately, Fisher's mother, Isabel Patterson Fisher, died of complications after childbirth, and he grew up living with his stepmother and father, John Donald Fisher, as well as various other family members. His middle name, Bell, came from his mother's name, Isabel. Fisher was one of 8 children, and when he was old enough, he commuted by train to high school in Stratford at the Stratford Collegiate Institute before attending high school in Kitchener. It was the beginning of the Depression when Fisher graduated high school and began to work for Bell, a telephone company in Windsor. Eventually, however, he moved back to Perth County and attended Teachers College in Stratford while boarding with an aunt and uncle. The building where he attended Teachers College is still standing today and is known as the Stratford Normal School. It was originally built in order to address concerns regarding the quality of rural education in Ontario. After obtaining his teaching certificate, Fisher went on to teach at various schools in Perth, including a school where his 2 younger stepbrothers were students. Fisher then moved to Toronto and taught at Grace Street Public School for 7 years. The school was opened in 1889 as an 8-room schoolhouse and was expanded in 1908 into a 17-room schoolhouse. The school was demolished in 1962, but not before both the First World War and Second World War honor rolls were moved to Charles G. Fraser Public School in Toronto, and a plaque was created in its place. Fisher eventually married Christine Fraser McTavish, a girl he had known from Stratford, Ontario, on April 16, 1938. Born on June 9, 1913, Christine grew up on her family's farm in Northeast Hope, the same township that Fisher was born in. She was the daughter of Alexander and Elizabeth McTavish, also of Scottish descent. By completing night school, Fisher would go on to earn his bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto. He and Christine lived together in Toronto after they were married and until the outbreak of war. On September 10, 1939, Canada officially entered the Second World War, and there was a push for action.
This was a chance guys who didn't have jobs or decent jobs were thinking, hey, this is an adventure. We're going to go to England, we're going to have times, we can go to pubs, meet lots of young ladies, we get involved in some fighting. This is a big adventure for us. So, you know.
Because Fisher had attended the University of Toronto, he was considered an ideal candidate for the Canadian Officer Training Corps at the university. The Corps had a long history in Canada prior to the Second World War and aimed, through careful training, to create an idealized man who was both above average in his military life and social interaction. The Canadian Officer Training Corps began in 1912 at McGill University after the British Officer Training Corps was established at Oxford and Cambridge in 1909. University of Toronto followed suit in September of 1914 and soon had a class of approximately 700 students. The Corps continued to grow, and in May of 1915, roughly 700 trainees crossed Lake Ontario in order to train at Camp Niagara. This marked the first of many training camps held there throughout the First and Second World Wars. The Corps continued to be active during the interwar years, and universities began to receive government funding in support of the program and to help improve facilities, in the hopes of training the best officers possible. They continued to offer courses in artillery, engineering, signals, infantry, machine guns, and medical services, and at the University of Toronto, thousands of cadets continued to receive commissions, which would become crucial in 1939 at the outbreak of the war. It was at this time that the University of Toronto's faction of the COTC secured a headquarters, 199 St. George Street. Today, it is still used by the University of Toronto and is called Woodsworth College. Unlike in 1914, when war was declared in 1939, there was little pressure to enlist right away in the university community. The priority was for students to continue training until graduation, so they would be able to better serve their country. This policy continued to be followed in order to avoid creating entire units of university students who had not completed their studies. Despite this, upon the outbreak of war, Fisher enrolled in the COTC. The 1939-1940 session at the University of Toronto was overwhelmed with new recruits, and the program was forced to build a two-story addition onto their headquarters on St. George Street. There was also a shortage of battle dress uniforms, which forced many of the members to parade on the first Wartime Remembrance Day in civilian clothes. In addition to the shortage of uniforms, however, a shortage of equipment prompted recruits to practice drill with the Ross rifle, a First World War weapon, instead of the Lewis machine gun. From June 10th to 22nd, 1940, 350 officers and cadets were given the opportunity to practice in field training in Niagara-on-the-Lake. In addition to the usual physical training, men also participated in military instruction. After completing training with the COTC, the selection process for officers was varied. Interviews were widely used and could be different depending on the interviewer. However, during the summer of 1942, the Canadian Army experienced an officer shortage and began using social science methods in order to evaluate candidates. It was also at this time that Lieutenant Elliot Jacques developed a frame of reference to help interviewers assess candidates' leadership abilities and personality. Interviewers would now have to look for robustness and adventurousness, convictions, freedoms from psychopathological trends or annoying traits, moral character, magnetism, self-confidence, articulateness, reserve, and discretion, many of which were observable traits. Because Fisher was given a commission before the officer shortage, he likely completed an interview during the selection process, and on September 25, 1940, just over 1 year after the outbreak of war and the beginning of his time at the COTC, Fisher enlisted in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and joined the Lincoln and Welland Regiment as a major. Niagara Camp in Niagara-on-the-Lake was used as a headquarters of the regiment. The camp had a long history in the area, as it was used as a training camp both prior to and during the First and Second World Wars. Beginning in 1871, thousands of soldiers began to use the area known as the Commons in Niagara for training, which would later become Camp Niagara or Niagara Camp during the Second World War. The camp continued to grow in 1908 and remained open until the Korean War. Many residents remember the military town feel that Niagara-on-the-Lake possessed after the outbreak of the Second World War, both because of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment's presence and the COTC training camps. The camp was very important to the town, both because of the connection to the military and the large economic and social incline that it caused in Niagara. Dances were held in the park pavilion every week, with hundreds of soldiers in attendance. Many soldiers married women they met in Niagara, prompting the town to continue to grow, and parades were frequent and exciting for the children of the town. The parades and marches stand out in the minds of the residents of the military town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. Residents describe watching soldiers, trucks, and equipment march by for over an hour on their way to train every day. Throughout the first year of the camp, the recruits had suffered from a lack of supplies, just as the COTC had, and the men were forced to parade in civilian clothes with Ross rifles. Training typically included rifle, bayonet, and squad drills as well as marching exercises. However, the University of Toronto yearbook in 1944 describes drills involving gas chambers during the summer of 1943. In the fall and winter of 1940 and 1941, the regiment was still struggling to develop discipline and punctuality, likely due to their presence on home soil. Absence without leave was a large part of this, and according to the regiment's war diary, in April of 1941, there were rumors circulating that the regiment would be moved in the near future, perhaps causing an increase in the number of AWOL cases. The camp itself was very recognizable, as the majority of the regiment slept in hundreds of white tents all across the commons, while the officers enjoyed boarding in private homes. Fisher was fortunate enough to have Christine with him during this time due to his status as an officer. However, she boarded in different houses with the numerous other single women and officers' wives, as many other officers had newly married.
Richard Romer, I don't know if you know the name, he was in the military, he was a general, he lives in Niagara region, he's written books on different things. Well, Richard Romer's older sister was a friend of my mother's. I guess when the men were at army camp, the women would get together and they lived in, and anyway, Richard Romer's parents were quite wealthy, lived in Niagara-on-the-Lake or somewhere down there, went away for the summer, so my mother and all these other single women had this place to themselves. Some of these women, I think, were able to drink copious quantities of alcohol, and there's some crazy stories. But
officers at the time had a very traditional view of marriage, and many saw it as an important factor that contributed to how they were viewed as officers and as men. In fact, many men who had recently finished training in the COTC quickly married in order to presumably cement one's manliness and fulfill their duty to the military. Fisher and Christine had married before the outbreak of the war. However, many men believed that manliness as an officer in the 1940s required upkeep, which meant consistently demonstrating masculinity through marriage, for example, in order to continue to be considered the ideal man. Like marriage, fatherhood and children were also seen as the epitome of masculinity, which brought about the likening of the officer-soldier relationship and the father-son relationship. Some masculine stereotypes, however, began to evolve, including notions about bravery or the suppression of fear. After the First World War, it became clear that talking about fear could be helpful during wartime once soldiers trusted their officer, as long as there was no justification of cowardly behavior. As an officer, Fisher had to navigate the complicated notions of manliness that came with becoming an officer of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment. Those who returned, however, had a difficult time coming home and returning to civilian life while navigating these concepts.
My uncle, my dad's one brother, Donald, who was with the Perth Regiment here, he eventually stayed in the military all life and wound up as a lieutenant colonel in the RCRs. But my aunt, I think I said that to you before, that 50 years after the war, he would wake up at night just screaming in a sweat. And she would say, what's wrong? And he would say, it's okay, it's nothing. Just had a bad dream. Then it was, suck it up. Be a man. Be a man and take this stuff. It's not, you must be a wimp if you can't deal with it. So nobody would talk about it. And it was pretty difficult for some of these guys.
Soon enough, the regiment was sent to Nanaimo, British Columbia in order to continue training. Again, Fisher and Christine were fortunate, as Christine accompanied the regiment on their journey. The regiment trained in Nanaimo for 3 months before briefly returning to Niagara and traveling to Newfoundland. Fisher stayed with the Lincoln and Welland Regiment for 1.5 years.
That's when they went to St. John's and were on duty in the harbor. And they got to know these people, the Newfies. So that's my connection to, I've never been to Newfoundland, but I was conceived in Newfoundland. So I do, everybody says, well, you're part Newfie in a way. And it was after, when my mother got pregnant, war going on, and at that time it was really uncertain. There were U-boats coming into St. John Harbor. England, Europe, it wasn't a done deal. We look back on it now and say, oh yeah, well, everything was happening. Britain, the Allies won the war. Well, at that time my father said, more or less, get out of here. And there were planes going out, but it was dangerous. And then the ferry, she went back, I think, to Nova Scotia, and there was concerns because the U-boats could be blowing up the boats. So I think my dad was quite concerned. He said, as soon as you get on dry land, send me a telegram to make sure, tell me you got. Nowadays you'd be on the iPhone, say, yeah, I got here 5 minutes ago, yep.
While Fisher was still in Newfoundland, his son Ian was born, and he was permitted to travel to Ontario for the christening when Ian was 6 weeks old. Tragically, this is the only time father and son would meet. Soon afterward, Fisher and the regiment traveled to England in order to continue training. The regiment consisted of 38 officers and 812 other ranks, and Fisher was a major of B Company. While in England, Fisher was injured, which prompted many to think that he should not be sent to France.
When they were in England, and we've talked about this before, but when one of the, what do they call them, the robot bombs that they sent from Germany and were dropped in England, one landed on the camp that they were stationed in just south of London. He ran one way from the cookhouse or something, and the other guys ran, and the other fellows were all killed. But in that blast, his hearing was damaged. And a few of the guys, other officers, more or less said to Mum afterwards, we don't know why he wanted to stay. He had enough, there was enough hearing injury that it could have, got him out and he would put him behind a desk job. But his comment was, well, that was my one, see, that was my close time. That's, he figured from now on he was home free because that was his closest, the closest he's been to death.
Fisher's medical records state that he had a small puncture wound over his right ear and right side of body, and a blast injury on his right eardrum.
So that, was something that my mother, I think, would dwell on a bit. Why the hell didn't he just stay out of it and get a desk job? And you never know, was it, when that night they attacked and he was shot, there were commands yelled. Was part of it because his hearing was affected, he didn't hear? We'll never know.
As a part of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, the regiment was supposed to have landed in France on June 28th. However, there was a delay, and the regiment did not reach France until July 25th. Upon their arrival in France, Fisher and the regiment moved through the ruins of Caen to the villages of Bourgibus and Tilly-la-Campagne. Tilly-la-Campagne, a village in the region of Normandy in northwest France, was the site of countless attacks and death during the late summer of 1944. It began with Operation Spring in late July, when the North Nova Scotia Highlanders were tasked with taking the village. The attack was preceded by an aerial bombardment, and with B and D companies in the east and C Company in the west, they attacked. There were communication difficulties and the death of the commanding officer of D Company, Major Matson, but they successfully captured the town after 4:30 a.m. on July 25th. A soldier described the fighting as something out of a nightmare.
All that dusty day of July 25th, the men kept crawling back with raw knees and arms and minor wounds. The whole affair had been more or less a nightmare. Those who escaped were they who crawled like snakes on the ground. It was one of the worst death traps soldiers had tried to cross, with practically every foot of ground ranged for machine gun fire.
Despite the difficult battle, Operation Spring continued, and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry managed to capture Verrier Village by 5:30 a.m. The operation continued to be a success throughout Phase 2. However, due to the heavy losses suffered by the Black Watch at Verrier Ridge during Phase 3 of the attack, the regiments holding positions, including the North Nova Scotia Highlanders in Tilly, were forced to withdraw, and the operation failed. The attacks on Tilly continued after Operation Spring, and the Calgary Highlanders were the next regiment tasked with taking Tilly in the early morning on August 1st, with D Company from the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, led by Major Jim Swayze, leading a divisionary attack from Borgebus at the same time. As soon as the Lincoln and Welland Regiment made it roughly 500 yards out of Borgebus, they saw what Swayze described as a sea of flame, and knew that turning back was the only option. At this point, it could be seen that Tilly had become something of a fixation with the Corps commander, and B Company from the Lincoln and Welland Regiment were again ordered to attack Tilly at midnight, giving the regiment another chance to participate in the action after only just arriving in France. According to eyewitnesses, the company made it no further than 500 yards out of Borgebus before they began to run forward, and the Germans were alerted. Soon, machine gun fire was all around the company, and Major Forbes Fisher was hit. Fisher was taken to a German field hospital and died of his injuries soon after. Unfortunately, the attack was unsuccessful, and the remainder of the company pulled back towards Borgebus. Fisher was declared missing for approximately 1 year before he was listed as killed in action, something that many war widows had to face. During that time, Christine always dreaded receiving telegrams.
And then it was about a year before they found out he was actually killed, and then they would send another. But it was very, very, very personal. Instead of now, if a police officer is killed, you'll see 2 officers go to the home, sit down, and tell the person about it. There, they fire off a telegram, say, "Your husband was killed," and she's all, more or less on her own on the farm by that time. It must have been difficult. But back then too, like my mother said, the telegram would come in. The village of Shakespeare had, I guess, the train station at that time. So the telegram operator, whatever you call it, would get this, print this out, and then they'd drive it down to the farm. So meanwhile, everybody in Shakespeare probably knew before she knew. Crazy times.
This long period of uncertainty took a toll on Christine, and she never remarried, passing away in November 2017 at the age of 104.
As I say, I found it very difficult, and my mom, I think, did too. So rather than sitting down talking, I wish I could have done it, but I think she found it difficult. I mean, a young woman on her own with a child back then. I think the military pension at those days was about $30 a month. It was, so we certainly, I don't mean we were poor, but we weren't like there was no, had my dad had have lived and taught, what he wanted to do is apparently stay in Toronto and teach there, and then buy a cottage maybe up in the Muskokas at that time, and then would spend the summer out of Toronto. But that didn't happen.
Fisher's name is memorialized both in Bretteville-sur-Laye's Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery and at St. Andrew's, a small cemetery in Northeast Hope, Ontario. Multiple memorials around the province bear his name as well, including the memorial arch beneath the Soldiers' Tower and the Victoria College World War II plaque at the University of Toronto. The memorial altar inside the Stratford Normal School bears his name as well, as Fisher attended there earlier in life. Fisher was only at the front for a mere few days, but his sacrifice ultimately helped the Allies capture Tilly during Operation Totalize. His short life is tragically the story of many who fought and died for Canada during the Second World War, More than 1 million Canadians served in the Canadian Armed Forces, and over 47,000 of them gave their lives for their country, much like the Lincoln and Welland Regiment's motto suggests is necessary. Though on the surface it may seem like Fisher's life was straightforward, the examination of his life and the context in which he lived proves to be endlessly fascinating, proving that each and every soldier who died for their country has a story, and that story deserves to be shared.